roughhousing between fathers and boys especially, but also daughters, is like a really, really important part of child's education, especially around physical intimacy and consent. Like a lot of boys grow up their entire lives and they only know two types of physical touch, which is sex and fighting. Men's health outcomes are awful across the board in every age category, in every single racial, ethnic and socioeconomic group, in every single country.
I don't think that we can agree that blanket equal opportunity is always going to deliver a system that we feel is fair.
And the patriarchy for me is just a big sort of very vague ideological bogeyman that is terrifying, but really is very difficult to observe and even more difficult to describe. Male victims of crimes considered violence against women. So male victims of violence against women, that's the sort of the ultimate backwards somersault mental gymnastics gold medal winning Olympic bullshit. So instead of seeing men as victims of violence by women, they're somehow now victims of violence against women. They're somehow women now.
I am right now discriminating against men in favor of women, knowing that some women also play that system, and it gives me no satisfaction to do that.
People constantly ask me, well, how do we make women feel safe? And I'm like, how about you stop pretending that half the world's population is out to oppress you through physical violence? That'd be a great way of helping women feel a little bit more safe.
I come from the world of the online business owners, and in that sort of community industry, call it what you may, the idea that we live and we are still oppressed by the patriarchy is as alive now as it was 7-8 years ago when I was starting. So can you sort of tell us about what you understand as a patriarchy nowadays, and what do you think about women essentially being oppressed by all these evil men?
Well, my mum is probably the most formative person in my life. She grew up in Zimbabwe and saw the horrors of real oppression by the hands of Robert Mugabe, a tyrant who murdered countless people. And she drilled it into me from a very young age that I have it great in this country. I'm not oppressed. No one's oppressed in this country. Women aren't oppressed. Men aren't oppressed in the UK today. And I think that's true. I feel like we should be extremely grateful for how good we have it. Not just we have it better than pretty much anyone in the world, but anyone in the world at any point in history. So personally, I think like the word oppression is not something you'll find on my page to describe either men or women in the UK. And yeah, patriarchy, the etymology of that word literally means father, patriarchy, dominator. So father dominator, the ruler of the family, essentially is what it's saying. And it goes back to a time when the dad was the sort of figurehead of the family, and he called the shots and he decided what happens. But in the UK today, I mean, fathers don't even have equal rights to their own children. So I struggle to understand how someone could be the so-called ruler of the family whilst not having actual rights to his own child, which is probably the most important thing in his life. And if you honestly think fathers are the ruler of the family in the UK, you should. I encourage you to spend maybe a week or so outside of family court, and you'll see how many destroyed, disempowered men, fathers there are. So I don't think it's the best way to view the world. I think it's inherently ungrateful and narrow-minded. And although there are some elements of so-called male power, there are also female power. So men often hold positions of hard power, but not always, and less so today. Hard power meaning political leadership, for example, whereas women have more soft power. Women have more influence. So it's really swings and roundabouts. And there are certain places, certain industries that are dominated by men, but then there are industries that are dominated by women. So like the family court system, the psychological system, the educational system, the third sector, the charity sector, the domestic violence industry, especially, talking 95%, 96%, 97% women, they're not patriarchal. They're the opposite, if anything. So it's not that I deny any sort of semblance of a patriarchy. It's more that I think there are better ways of viewing the world today, more inclusive, ones that recognize how men are hurt, men and boys are hurt, as well as women and girls. And the patriarchy for me is just a big sort of very vague ideological bogeyman that is terrifying, but really is very difficult to observe and even more difficult to describe. So it's not a scientific concept that I think is helpful, and increasingly less helpful every single year. So yeah, I mean,
I think
you talked
that
about being a woman in business. I mean, did you know like 40% of new businesses are owned by women? So I mean, it's let go of this. We need to let go of this idea that women are oppressed and incapable, and start to notice that women are actually doing amazing things already.
to be honest with you, it was actually in that industry where I really started paying attention to what's actually happening in the culture, because I saw the huge gap between essentially the most free and independent of, for example, a man's finances, let's say, women that were the loudest about the idea of living in this oppressed patriarchy and somehow not having opportunities to start businesses. To me, that was it was really clashing with reality. So I started like looking at certain narratives that are being fed, and I do think that they are being fed because there is rarely ever an original conversation being done about it. Most people that will post something online, it's like regurgitated stuff that they've heard elsewhere. But the really interesting thing about the oppression that you touched upon, I come from Poland, so um,
Mm,
if you can voice your opinion and voice your protest about something that you are not happy with, you're not oppressed. The countries that are honestly oppressing people, you just simply can't do that. If you do, you're either arrested, killed, you face serious prosecutions. So the whole idea, I think, around the oppression and patriarchy, particularly, I actually like your idea that let's leave oppression aside, but the patriarchy just became this buzzword that really doesn't mean what it used to mean anymore. And it was almost like a term that was hijacked, but it's still fed to young women. And I think it's to disadvantage of both sexes.
yeah, I think the actual concept of the patriarchy is what's oppressive. Like the belief in the patriarchy is what is oppressing women. Like women and young girls being told that you're being oppressed by your male peers. You're going to be your entire life is going to be a struggle against the patriarchy. Men are going to control you through fear and acts of violence. So those concepts are what is oppressive and terrifying to women. People constantly ask me, well, how do we make women feel safe? And I'm like, how about you stop pretending that half the world's population is out to oppress you through physical violence? That'd be a great way of helping women feel a little bit more safe. So I feel
Yeah.
like it's the belief in the patriarchy that I find is particularly damaging and terrifying and dehumanizing for boys and terrifying for girls and mostly unhelpful.
And I think
But I mean, I'm
another
a white
another
man, so I would say that.
yeah, you're
Typical.
privileged white
Someone's
man.
gonna. I'm just sort of reading the mind of some of the people watching this, and they're like, "Oh my god, he's," and I'm straight. So I mean, bloody hell. I mean,
You've got
but
you've got it
yeah, it
all
doesn't. It
stacked against you, George.
yeah, it's easy mode.
But I think another sort of way in which patriarchy is sort of being dragged into the conversations, I think unnecessarily, is when we are looking at disparate outcomes when it comes to men and women, and health is one of these. So this is something that I definitely wanted to chat to you about. Tell us what's going on with men's health nowadays.
But the best data we have for men's health is coming from America. So I'm going to talk to you about American data. Although it's broadly the same across other societies in the West, including the UK. But yeah, I mean, people use women's health as a barometer for so-called the patriarchy oppressing women. But I mean, if you look at the actual outcomes, it's actually men now in America that are falling behind and have fallen behind for decades. So the facts are, men lead in 13 of the top 15 causes of death. They're behind. They're in terms of health outcomes. They're behind in every single racial, ethnic, socio-economic group. They die at 1.4 times the rate as women overall, and they live less life in every single country in the world, not just America, but literally every single country a man can live is expecting to live less life than women. So less life, more likely to die at every age group, worse health outcomes across every single demographic group. And now being a man is the single largest demographic factor of early death. So That's the biggest thing that causes early death, being a male. And I know Randolph Neese, he's quoted as saying that if you could equalize male and female mortality rates, you'd actually do more good than curing cancer. So that's how serious it's gotten. So men's health outcomes are awful across the board in every age category, in every single racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic group, in every single country. And yet we're still not really talking about it. There's about 7 or 8 now federal offices in the American government to support and research women's health, which is excellent. But there's not a single one for men and boys, not one governmental department for men and boys' health in America, but 7 or 8. I think there's 8 now. Biden's just added a new one, the White House Commission of Women and Girls' Health. But that doesn't sound very patriarchal to me. Like if men are leading in 13 of the top 15 causes of death in America, and yet there is no actual dedicated funding for their health, how is that a patriarchy? The same in the UK. It's not so different, but men's health is dreadful, and of course, the biggest risk to life for any young man, is suicide, and obviously that's a massive epidemic and deserving of a conversation in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are some organizations that are starting to do some work specifically in the UK and in States to actually bring some public interest to the issue, but it seems to be a slow burner of the project. It isn't posh. It isn't going to score you like cards on. It isn't to score you a lot of cheap likes on TikTok, for example, or on Instagram.
No.
If you are going to be going on about the men's rights, because I would imagine 20 to 15%, 15 to 20% of the comments are going to be, well, what about women, blah, blah, blah. But there is an interesting sort of theme, especially in health, because we can see it like really, really well. When you look at your advocacy, I suppose, let's call it that. When you look at your advocacy, are you trying to level the field on the opportunity front, or are you trying to level the field on the outcome front?
Normally opportunity. I mean, I'm definitely a believer in equal opportunity. Just because you're afforded the same opportunities doesn't mean you deserve equal success. So in terms of equal outcomes, and I'm not expecting men and women to be sort of represented in every single level of society in equal numbers at all. Like I don't think men and women are the same in that way. But when I see 7 or 8 different federal government departments for women's health, then I expect to see the same for men and boys.
Yeah.
I don't want more or less. There's only a few areas where I'm actually pro equality of outcome, and that is in things like education, which we can talk about. And it's another great example of going against the patriarchy is that how far behind boys have become in education in the West. But it's just like life expectancy. It's their boys are behind at every stage of education, every single age group, in more or less every single Western country in the world, and have been for decades, for as long as I've been alive. And nothing is said and done. Again, we looked at how women and girls are behind in education 50 years ago, and we pointed to it and said that's the patriarchy. But now boys and men are even further behind than they were 50 years ago, and we don't say anything. We still insist that women and girls are the ones that are oppressed and disadvantaged in education, which is not true. One of the reasons why boys are behind in education is because of an underrepresentation of male teachers in schools, especially in early years in primary school. So that's one of the few areas where I actually am pro equality of outcome. Like I just want to see more men teaching boys. But I recognise it's inherently unfair equality of outcome. But for me, the benefit to boys of having men in classrooms is a benefit worth having, and the unfair price of equality of outcomes worth it, in my opinion. But overall, I'm massively pro equality of opportunity.
I think what's really interesting there is you've actually made a distinction between different. We should be having an honest discussion about whether we are actually where we are trying to sort of level the field. So, for example, sort of going back to the health, right? We know that men across all societies live shorter lives. Now, there has been some arguments made that biologically speaking, men are way more expensive to run. So your systems essentially, because you're bigger, stronger, blah, 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 your systems would be subjected to way more wear and tear.
Mm.
And women, for example, our immune systems are stronger.
Yeah.
So, but there is this whole, it's a funny sort of system to get right, because I don't think that we can agree that blanket equal opportunity is always going to deliver a system that we feel it's fair. So, for example, going back to the medical field, to have really equal opportunities for men and women to have, for example, their specific sort of biological needs understood, we would need to
Mm.
have unequal funding. And the reason for that is women are three types of beasts depending on where we are in our cycle. And the book of Sarah Hill, that was talking about your brain on the pill, just absolutely blew my mind about it. Part of the reason why there isn't as much research done on women isn't patriarchy, it's just because we are actually very, very expensive to study, because the hormones change everything about how we react. So, straight
Yeah.
away, to even get to equal opportunities, we would need to have unequal funding. But at
Yeah.
least then we would have an opportunity to have a level outcome. And even then, we might not be able to get there ideally if, as I spoken to like evolutionary biologists and their I don't know whether it's a fact or whether it's a theory or whether it's a hypothesis, but that men are just more expensive to run. Like, you just sort of go through the wear and tear quicker. But I think the fact that
Mm.
we are not looking at that, that's the kind of problem, because nobody seems to be having like a nuanced discussion about what we can do with the limited resources we have to make sure that we can balance equal opportunities and equal outcome as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, there is absolutely a significant biological element to why men live less life than women. Part of it's down to testosterone having sort of dampening effect on the immune system, and you're very right that women have a stronger immunity than men, which is one of the reasons why men died so much more from COVID. I think it's like men 1.6 times more likely to die from COVID, and 3 times more likely to be seriously to go to ICU if they get COVID than women. So there's a biological element, partly testosterone, partly the XY chromosome. So obviously, not a complete second chromosome for men leaves them biologically vulnerable too. But that's not the entire gap, like because the gap grows and shrinks over time. If it
Mm-hmm.
was just a biological thing, the gap would be the same every single year in every single country. But sometimes I think the gap in life expectancy between men and women about 100 years ago was only a few years. Now it's like 4 or 5 years in the UK. So it's clearly a socialized element to it too, and there is. I mean, there's interesting studies in Germany, for example, after the war, there was a massive increase, I think, in life expectancy between men and women, like the difference, and yet there was a cloistered population of monks and nuns. 10,000 monks and nuns were basically cloistered in like a part of Bavaria where they were just completely separate from society. So it was a really interesting opportunity to measure this biological side of the life expectancy gap, because you had 10,000 nuns, 10,000 monks living in a space completely separate from society. They're both living more or less the exact same lives, living the same lifestyle, working the same, living in the same area, eating the same food, and the gap between them was just 1 year. So it wasn't 4 years; it was just 1 year. So that's like a really great way of understanding how big is the gap, the biological gap, and I reckon it's about 1 year. And it's impossible to deny that men live less life because of biology, but it's not as big as it is now. In some countries, especially in Eastern Europe, in Russia, for example, men can live 10 years less life than women. So there's no way that is entirely biological. So it's,
Mm-hmm.
as always, it's a bit of both. And yes, there are biological and sociological elements to it. And I would argue that even if it is biological, that isn't a good enough reason to just completely wash our hands of it. There are other groups. I mean, I'm a professional content creator. I work a lot of the National Health Service in the UK, and there are other groups that are biologically vulnerable to to other to other diseases like diabetes and
Yeah.
South Indian and Black populations. They're more vulnerable to diabetes. I work with those groups too, and I get paid money to help educate them and help reduce that problem. And at no point have we been like, well, they're just biologically more vulnerable. We're going to wash our hands of it and move on. Like, whether it's biological or sociological is to be debated. but neither of that is an excuse not to do anything, which is what we're currently doing.
Absolutely. But I like if we are even trying to sort of make a point that somehow we shouldn't be interested in men's rights because of women, we are completely forgetting about the fact that 99% of women are straight and they will have husbands, dads, brothers, sons, especially sons that and husbands that they will care an awful lot about. So leveling the field, or at least trying to do something to figure out what is it about the way that we are living our lives in Western societies that's so different from those monks, although we can probably point at few, and the education and all the downstream effects from that's been unfolding for the last 60 years. They will probably have something to do with it as well. But there should be some sort of action behind the idea that, or the pretense that we are trying to have equal opportunities. Like that also includes men.
This is what the frustrating thing is. It's like, I don't have all the answers. Of course, I'm not qualified to have this conversation. I'm just a podcaster. I just have ideas and I just do research. I don't get paid for this. I'm not funded by anyone. This is just something I'm doing out of my own interest and goodwill. This should not, I mean, I'll be the first to say this isn't work that I should be doing. This is work that should be done by the government and funded bodies as part of an Office for Men's Health or as part of a Minister for Men campaign, where these issues are investigated by qualified, funded individuals who can actually do the research properly, targeted research, dedicated research that understands why are men living less life. This shouldn't be some sort of hypothetical discussion between two people who, frankly, no offense, neither of us are qualified to have this discussion. And yet here we are, we're the best you've got. And I'm really sorry we're the best you've got, but our government is just not interested in learning more themselves, and they're not interested in putting money into it. Because it's not a vote winner. Same for education. I'm always asked, like, why are boys behind in education, let alone why are they behind in every stage of education in every single country in the West? I don't know. I mean, I have some good ideas, but no one's asking the question. No one knows. No one knows. Even the best people in this field, like Richard Reeves, he doesn't know. And the fact that he doesn't know is the problem. He shouldn't, because no one's asking the questions. No one bothers to find out. Just like there is no Office for Men's Health, there's no sort of organization for boys in education either. So we don't know. So for the time being, the best we've got of finding out are conversations between you and I and people like us, well-meaning but ultimately unqualified individuals. And that's the damning indictment of the problem. And that's not good enough. It's not good enough that male suicide is the biggest risk to my life, for example, and we just simply don't really know what's causing it, and no one's bothering to find out. So yeah, I'm not the right person to have this conversation, but I'm the best you've got, unfortunately.
I think we can all point to a slither of truth, but it's very difficult with such a complex systems. It's very difficult to actually figure out exactly what's going on unless there is a serious and organized effort from people, like you said, way more qualified than we are, to actually look at it and sort of leave the partisan sort of sex wars at the door of the research lab. The really interesting thing, for example, in education, I think, when it comes to men, is that when the affirmative action has started, the split between men and women that were in universities was 40% women, 60% men. Well, right now we are already past the point where that has switched completely. And
then
you can imagine what would be the headline in Guardian or BBC if there was an idea of affirmative action for men in education. It would be just outrage.
Like you said, 50 years ago, women and girls absolutely were behind education. About 40% of university enrollees were women, 60% men. That's not fair. And there was a huge amount of political ambition and change that changed everything in the 1970s in America. And like you said, the pendulum has swung. In the early 80s, equality is achieved. So that at that point, no longer 40-60, it's 50-50. And then we just kept on going. So that was in 1981, so 40 years ago. And we just keep going and going and going. And now men are further behind now than women and girls were 50 years ago. and there's nothing. Like, look around you, there's no political ambition, there's no rallies, there's no like advocacy. Most people, I think, probably still think women and girls are behind education, which is just a complete lie. And there's nothing. There was no one. There's no protest in the streets. You can't even talk about it without looking around like you're doing something wrong. So, and there's certainly no affirmative action. And the affirmative action, actually, it does exist, is still in favour of women and girls across every single group. That there were more scholarships and awards for women's education in America than for men. And I'm like, well, they're ahead in every group, and you're still giving them this. It blows your mind sometimes. I don't understand how anyone could look at this and stay calm. It's outrageous, and it just doesn't. I must be missing something, because everyone seems very chill about it, and I don't. I've yet to understand why.
I think sometimes when we talk about these type of issues, the response that we get on social media is like literally a mirror image to the response that we get in social life, in like our actual communities when we speak to real people.
Mm.
I don't know many mothers that are not worried about their sons. And to
Yeah.
be honest with you, I don't know many mothers that are not worried about their daughters, but for completely different reasons.
Mm.
And I think there is a reason to be worried for our children on both sexes, whether they are male or female. They face completely different challenges as they are growing
Mm.
up, than even to the challenges that we faced. I'm assuming that you are roughly sort of my age. So in education, I think the interesting thing about the male teachers, particularly in the preschool sort of early years, what would
Mm.
it take to actually get men into teaching? Because I had a conversation to David Geary about it, and overall, teaching isn't like an inherent field that men on average are going to flock
Mm.
to. Now, we would need to create like an extra incentive system to either increase the status of that job somehow in the culture, take
Yeah.
the culture and BBC and Guardians on
Yeah.
board, or
Like in
and
South
that's going
Korea,
to be so easy.
teachers in South Korea, for example, they're seen like right at the top of society, like right up with like doctors and engineers and teachers in South. Like they're one of the most respected roles in South Korean, and that is absolutely how it should be. So I mean, just to give you a quick answer, is like, yeah, pay teachers more, give them more respect, and like that'll benefit obviously women too. But a lot of men, don't want to be a teacher because it doesn't pay them well enough. So
Yeah.
definitely pay them more.
But then do you actually think that if we just increased like the salaries of the teachers, that the amount of then women that would flock more into the system still wouldn't leave like men at very, very margins of teaching? Like, I actually don't
Well,
know how strong those incentives would have to be to get men into like into teaching.
that's what I mean. That's why I said earlier, like getting men into teaching is the only area of equality of outcome that I can think of right now that I actually
Yeah.
support. I'm not sure, because it's so urgent and because the benefit of having men in classrooms is so beneficial to boys, and I want to see that benefit immediately. Like I would be in favour probably of equality of outcome that says, like currently in the UK, only about a quarter of schools in England don't have any male teachers. So not one male teacher in the entire school, and that's a quarter, a
The
quarter.
entire
So
school.
yeah, it's not one male teacher, and then about
Wow.
80% of classrooms are female, and that goes up and up and up the younger and younger you get, to the point about kindergarten in America, for example. There are actually more women flying military jets in the US military as a share of the population than there are men teaching kindergarten. So that's how badly it's gone. Like way more women flying military jets. I think 3 times more as a share of the population than men teaching kindergarten, and like we never talk about it. So
Wow.
I would like to see, in the same way that we've got women into STEM, like through campaigns that actually champion women in STEM and show the benefits and actually encourage it, destigmatize it. I'd love to see that for men in teaching, which doesn't exist. And I'd love to see a destigmatization of men working around children as a whole. Like I get so many messages from men who like love children, want to be a parent, want to be a dad, and they can't like walk past the park or even wave to a kid without being getting the side eye or accused of being some sort of paedophile. Like, we are very suspicious around men and children, which is not fair, considering the number one abuser of children isn't even men; it's actually women. And this guilt we have around men in general, especially around kids, is massively feeding into the problem of teaching. Men don't want to spend time with children, not because they don't like children, but because they don't want to leave themselves vulnerable to being accused of things they haven't done. And yeah, I'd
Yeah.
say more respect, more pay, targeted campaigns to destigmatize the career for men, and also just a growing up of discourse around men working around children and being around children and not seeing them as inherently predatory or inherently dangerous to children.
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite a masculine character, but I still I can't give my son the same type of play as my partner and uncles and so on and so forth can.
Absolutely.
It's
Rough
just
housing.
yeah, yeah, and I do try and do that. Don't get me wrong, I do because I love it as well. But
It's not the same.
but no, 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 no. What I actually find about men is guys tend to be so innovative, like so playful. Like I can literally like leave, I don't know, go to make a cup of tea, and then by the time I come back, like guys will find a way to make up this like ridiculous game that I would never think of, but they are having so much fun with it. And it's like it's not just sort of the rough housing, it's that on the spot innovation of games. Like it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable to me. I don't have that sort of in me, if you know what I mean. I really need to try, and it just doesn't come
Yeah,
naturally.
I'm seeing that from
Um,
my sister who's had two children recently with her husband, and I'm seeing the exact same thing. He's the one that's a bit more like physical, throwing the babies in the air, spinning around, and they love it. And when I visit them, they want that from me as well. Like, I want to do Spider-Man, but my sister's there like, oh my God, like kind of terrified. And it's a shame, like rough housing as well has been shamed as well. Like, it's been vilified as boys will be boys, and rough housing is seen as by a lot of people as something that's bad. When in fact, rough housing between fathers and boys, especially, but also daughters, is like a really, really important part of child's education, especially around physical intimacy and consent. Like, a lot of boys grow up their entire lives and they only know two types of physical touch, which is sex and fighting. Whereas rough housing introduces you to a whole medley of physical touch and play in between that. And like, it's just a really great way of showing boys what physicality means and consent and boundaries and fun. And like,
yeah,
and yet rough housing by a lot of people has been seen as something to be condemned. And it's not. It's a really important part that a lot of children are missing now. I think a lot of
yeah.
children miss that, especially
It's
about
exhilarating
computers
for
and
them,
games and stuff.
and they
Yeah, I miss
absolutely
it.
love it. They absolutely love
And for
it, and
dads. And dads love it too.
yes,
Like, it's
yeah,
exhausting, but I
absolutely.
love making my niece walk along the ceiling. It's like it's I can't believe how tiring it is, but I mean, it is also good fun.
Yeah. But what I actually, and I love a lot about your work, but what for me, your work is all about flagging the issues that we can then think about. And one of the issues that you flagged that I've spent hours thinking about, and initially when I saw it, I was like, oh, no way. So let's talk about that, because I do want to have like a try and have a really healthy debate about it, like what we can do. And as if the
What
topics
is
that you
it?
don't as if the topics that you cover are not controversial enough, how about the men's right to choose?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah,
So tell
sure.
us
Well, I mean,
about the right to choose.
I don't. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir if I talk to you about women's right to choose. Personally, I'm pro-choice. I've always been pro-choice. I fundamentally believe that the choice of when or if to become a parent should be down to the parent, not themselves. I've been kind of horrified to see what's happening in America to women's right to choose, and I would like to see that conversation extended to men. So men after conception don't have the right to choose. They're beholden to the decision of their mother. Whether she keeps that or not is her choice, as it should be. And I'm not arguing that he should be able to override her choice in any way. Absolutely not. But I feel like he should be able to potentially exercise his own choice to be a parent in the same way that she does through her right to have an abortion or take the morning after pill. He should be able to opt in or out of all privileges and responsibilities to that child if he makes the mother to be aware of his decision early in the pregnancy. So a man and a woman, they have sex. Let's say she becomes pregnant. Let's say they wore a condom or didn't, but she's become pregnant. She has the right to choose whether she keeps that child. And I'm saying that should he also have that right to opt in or out of parenthood? And so she can make an informed decision. Ultimately, the question is an independent woman making a unilateral decision of becoming a parent, should she be able to expect a man to finance that choice? I don't think she should. I feel like a man should have the same choice, and he shouldn't have to finance a choice that she's making autonomously. And a lot of people say, well, if he didn't want to be a dad, he shouldn't have had sex. But I'm like, well, I'm pro-choice. I don't think consenting to sex is consenting to parenthood. Like that's one of the core tenets of feminism. Like consenting to sex is not consenting to parenthood. And yet, whenever I talk about a father's right, that's the first thing they say. And I'm like, does that not apply to men? Like, a woman who has sex shouldn't. She's not saying I want to be a parent. She's saying I want to have sex. Same for men. And I don't know how I feel about that. Again, that's a conversation that's not happening. I'm not sure if I'm entirely behind the idea of allowing men that right. It's called a paper abortion, or more recently known as voluntary parental surrender. I don't know how I feel about it, but I want to have that discussion. But we're not having that discussion apart from right now. And it's like, again, this
No.
conversation should be had by more qualified economists, politicians, political scientists, psychologists. I don't know. Not. This is. It should be had. It should be a debate that's worth having. And I feel like allowing a man to choose whether he becomes a dad is a really great way of ensuring we have great dads. And we all benefit from having great dads, committed dads who chose to become one, rather than being legally compelled or blackmailed into being a dad, which is currently what we're doing.
Yeah.
So
I
that's the
think the
right to
reason
choose.
why that bit irked me is naturally, I don't want to actually get into the conversation about abortion because that could be like 2 hours long. But me personally, I
Yeah.
sit a little bit more on the conservative side. So I actually don't believe that we are in the position where we could ban abortion without just an absolute mess, and we've created that mess. But I do think that we should have more restrictions than we currently have, and that currently the UK is, for example, trying to get to in terms of very late stage abortions. But that's me and
Well,
sort of my conservative bent, without even putting any moral judgment on the abortion, whether it's moral right. The fact that currently we do have this imbalance where women are afforded the rights essentially that men aren't in the same way. But what's the sort of bit that I find difficult is we know that men on average are higher in social sexuality that women are, but then also men do actually have two successful mating strategies. So you can be a devoted father of few children, for example, or several children, or you can be very, very undevoted father of 20 or 30. And, several of them will sort of make it into the future. Now, this is assuming that you're going to sort of work on yourself, because you wouldn't be able to just easily impregnate like 30 women. You would need to have something about you, whether it's charm, money, status, you name it. But essentially, because of that higher social sexuality and because of the two technically in evolutionary sort of successful mating strategies, women only have got one successful sort of reproductive strategy, and that is high investment. So I think that if we had that, even though that I agree that on the opportunity side, that would be level, that would produce disproportionate amount of women that would be left, and kids essentially that would be left disadvantaged, because there will be a small percentage of men that will game that system like mad.
Mm.
And it is difficult because I am now, right now, discriminating against men in favor of women, knowing that some women also play that system. And it
Yeah.
gives me no satisfaction to do that. But I think that's where I land right now.
I think is I know plenty of men who have been pushed into a place of fatherhood against their will, having told their mother that they don't want to be a dad, and she got pregnant, either intentionally or unintentionally, in a way, and then forced him to become a dad, and then financing that choice. So I mean, he's going to pay for that child for 18 years or
Yeah.
more. So the gaming of the system has already begun. And because that man has no ability to, but I don't want this child. I never want this child. This is not something I don't want to. I'm not certainly want to pay for it. That's the system that's already set up. So there's gaming either way. And yeah, I mean, although I mean you sound more pro-life than I am pro-choice. You seem to be pro-life, and although I don't agree, I do respect your opinion of being sort of consistent. Like rather than people that are pro-choice for women and then seem to be pro-life for men. Like don't they want to give women choice but not men. So that's where I'm most confused. But there's an interesting theory it's called Donahue-Levitt hypothesis, and it was a really interesting, controversial economics theory from the 90s in America that looked at in America there was basically a massive crime spike of violence right across the nation. That through the 70s and 80s it was going up, and it got to the 90s to the point where they were talking about rivers of blood running through New York. And then suddenly crime came down in the 90s, and a lot of people didn't know why. They were asking, is it increased policing? Is it higher sentences? Is it change in drug reform? Is it more police officers? And then two economists, Donahue and Levitt, came along and said, we think it's the fact that abortion was legalized a generation earlier. And they hypothesized that because women were given the right to choose to become a parent or not, they weren't being forced into raising children they didn't want and couldn't afford. And they argued that criminality in young juveniles, particularly males, criminality is caused by unwantedness, and unwantedness is reduced by abortion. So by not allowing women to choose, they were having children against their will. They didn't want, that they might resent, or just didn't want. They can't afford it. They're not going to be a great parent because they don't want to become a parent. Like a good parent is one that chose to become one. A bad parent is one that's forced into it. So a generation earlier than 1990s, women were given that choice to become a parent or not, and that's what they argued led to a decrease in crime because of reduced unwantedness and therefore reduced criminality. And I look at the same. I would say the same now. Like we're having quite a huge spike in knife crime in the UK, and there's obviously a lot of crime
Yeah.
in America. A lot of that is coming from fatherless homes, like boys that are growing up without a dad in their home, probably because he didn't want to become a dad and he left. And I'd say if we could find a way of putting more committed dads into households, especially households of boys, would we see a similar decrease in violent crime now? Is that the problem now, like fatherlessness? And can we reduce fatherlessness by giving men choice? So again, these are conversations that no one's having. I'm talking purely hypothetically, but I
Yeah.
mean they're interesting conversations that are unfairly shamed.
Yeah, I think in general we've come so far on the choices and giving individuals all sorts of freedoms that just going back to, for example, banning abortion, I don't actually think it works. What I would really prefer to do is get really smart people that get the behavior of humans to create a completely different incentive structure. So for me, rather than like a blanket ban, which currently I don't think it would work, it's sort of reel it back a little bit, just temporary, and urgently put some healthy incentive structures so we essentially get to the point where we just have less need for abortions. And I think it could be done again if there was interest. There doesn't seem to be much interest. And yeah, but that was
Well,
one
I
of
think
these things that you raised, which I was like, I've spent hours thinking about it because it
good.
is it is prickly. It is a prickly subject, but and I can see unfairness on both sides. But I would still currently land on the fact that that small proportion of men would game the system like a lot, and I think a
But what
lot
about what
would
about
be
baby trapping
better.
though?
What? Sorry.
But what about like baby trapping? Women that get a man gets pregnant
Oh
and
God,
basically push a man into
yeah.
fatherhood. Like, is that not gaming the system, or is that a smaller problem than you envision this other
Um,
problem being? The lesser of two
I
evils, I suppose.
okay. So I definitely know it's a
What about
problem, but
what about women
I
that
also
rape boys and then force them to pay child support?
oh God, like okay, but
Like babysitters have done that.
that we could really balance the entire system a little bit more on the legal front. And again, the court system currently heavily skewed towards women. And again, from biological point of view, there is an argument to be made that, for example, the mother tends to be the person that is needed more in the first 3 years of life of a baby in terms of their development, breastfeeding, and all that. There is a ton of benefits there, but dads are not needed in that equation. If there is a breakup of the relationship, straight away you are not going to have an ideal situation, and I think it's a damn shame. But it's difficult. So imagine the situation when you've got mother that is gaming the system. She's not necessarily, a healthy mother to be around, but she's breastfeeding the child, for example. We are looking at the breakdown of the relationship when the child is 1.
Mm.
We would try and figure out whether the disadvantage that would come from the fact that that kid is now no longer around the father, more than the disadvantage that the child would get, for example, if the mother was just to stop breastfeeding, or, for example, I don't know, maybe we could figure out a system where we invest more in mediation, at least to keep that couple intact for the first 3 years, when developmentally speaking, that kid needs two parents, but for completely two different reasons, and one of those reasons just can't be supplemented ideally by a man. But again, that's oppression, right? Because if someone doesn't want to be together, then in the ideal scenario for the kid, we would be gluing them together until a certain point in time.
Well, I think they should be forced to spend time in the same household, but I feel like every effort should be made so that both parents can remain a part of that child's life. Like, I don't think they necessarily have to live together. I mean, ideally they would, but even if they were living apart, I feel like
Close by,
better
for
effort should be made
example.
that the child can spend a split time between the mother and father.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily about what the rights of the parents are. The most important thing is the child has a right to be with both parents, both mother and father. And that's just not happening. Like in the legal system, for example, in America, we don't have that position. Like the mother is almost always seen as the better parent, which is not true. And I feel like I want custody battles to be fought on what's called the presumption of joint custody. So
Yeah.
the judge enters that courtroom and he's like, I'm going to presume that we're going for joint custody, and from this level playing field, both of you can build your arguments on why or if you want more than that. But that's not how it works. Currently, in almost all states, we don't have that law, and the mother is favoured, which I don't think is right.
Australia had it, and then their latest government abolished it, which I thought was a damn shame. But I think on the sex front, part of the reason why we might be sort of having some disagreements is because currently you've got few areas, and all of these areas are currently giving the extra power to a woman. And I'm aware of it. So, I'm 5'2". My partner is double my size, essentially. I could take the kids, well, the son that we've got and another one that we've got on the way relatively easily if I wanted to game the system.
Mm.
Create few bruises and all that. Um, accuse
Yeah.
him falsely. There is no evidence anywhere. It would be she says, he says,
Yeah.
impossible to judge. I could potentially, make his life a complete and utter misery. And I don't think
Mm.
that it should be as easy as it currently is. And I know it's easy because I've seen enough people, not just in the UK, States, Australia, to sort of go through that. So I think that even if we balanced it out on, for example, the family court systems, it would already provide a little bit of the protection. But I don't know. Do you think that we can ever get to the point where, like, there is not going to be someone that is going to be, like, not screwed by whatever system we are going to, like, come up with?
Yeah. I mean, it's an aim, isn't it? I mean, we don't necessarily have to get there. I live in a real world. There's always going to be people who live in a world of coming up to 8 billion people. I mean, there's always going to be a lot of hardship, but that doesn't mean we should abandon that objective altogether.
Yeah.
But it's just more about I want to change the legal system so at least the legal framework isn't corrupt. Like at least the legal system can set down, at least at initial stage, some sort of guidelines for who is the best parent or who isn't, and equality of the sexes needs to be legislated. That doesn't mean that that's not going to solve the problem altogether, but there are certain things we can solve and there's certain things we can't. But in terms of the way our laws are written, where in quite literally black and white, mothers are seen as the main parent and fathers are seen as second class parent, that's something that we can solve. That's not hard. We just rewrite that law, and like I said, I'm not on the list. This problem will still remain, but it will be improved significantly. It's like I
Yeah.
don't want just because I don't think we can reach perfection doesn't mean we should throw away any sort of ambition for progress.
No, that
And
there is
yeah,
there are massive gains to be done between a system that is currently quite shocking in certain areas to a perfection. There is so much gain there, so much playing field.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to gamma bias. What is gamma
Gamma
bias?
bias. Gamma bias is a new theory, relatively new, of cognitive dissonance that's been developed by two friends of mine, two psychologists, clinical psychologists. One, Martin Seeger, another, Dr. John Barry from the Center for Male Psychology. And gamma bias is basically a combination of different biases across society, four, in fact, but where the male sex is simultaneously highlighted or erased, depending on what we're talking about. So gamma bias is split into four quadrants, and it tells us in the areas of privilege and perpetration, the male sex is highlighted. So we talk a lot about male privilege and how patriarchal society is and how much easier it is for men. And we also talk about male perpetration, so male violence, patriarchal control, violence against women and girls. So we highlight the male sex in perpetration and privilege, and then the opposite, beta bias, is basically how we erase the male sex within the area of celebration, and we erase the male sex in areas of victimhood. So we don't really talk about violence against men and boys. We only talk about violence against women and girls. And we don't really celebrate the male sex as men, but we're surrounded by celebrations of women and acknowledgement of the power of women and feminism and the future's female and so on and so forth. We don't really see that for men. We get the opposite. We're called toxic, etc. So gamma bias is how we don't look at the good things of men, and we do over focus in on the bad things of men. So, like acts of heroism, for example, are overwhelmingly by men. Most bystander interventions and rescues are by men. Most firefighters are men. And that's never seen as a gendered thing. We don't gender heroism in that way. We don't see male heroism, but we do gender violence. And the interesting thing is, like, the exact same percentage of firefighters are men are the same as murderers are men. It's the exact same disparity. and yet firefighters quite rightly has been made gender neutral by an inclusion of women. About 1 in 10 are women, and yet violence against women and girls hasn't been made gender neutral, and yet it's the same disparity, about 10%. So that's gamma bias. I recommend looking into it. It's very, very interesting. You'll see it all the time. You'll see it like in Gaza right now. You'll see like horrible headlines about 50 people killed, including 15 women and children. And you'll see women and children highlighted, like specifically highlighted in the area of victimhood when there's some sort of disaster against the society. It's always women and children that are pointed out. And then the men are never pointed out unless we're looking at perpetration, in which case that's all we seem to talk about. So gamma bias tells us that we highlight the male sex in areas of perpetration and privilege, and we minimize or erase entirely the male sex in the area of celebration and victimhood. And it's one of those things that once you switch onto it, once you're doing a bit of reading, you'll see it everywhere. You see it in the news, you see it on TV, you see it on social media, you see it in the streets. It's quite an incredible phenomenon once you've spotted it.
It's impossible not to see in the articles when we're looking at,
Yeah.
a person that saved someone. It's a Londoner. It's a civil. It's a person.
Passerby,
If
a
it's
Samaritan.
if it's a murder, it's a man.
Yeah,
And it's like
yeah, like
it's
you see it in the
subtle,
same
right?
story.
It's subtle. Unless you know about it, you won't notice it. But I just
You'll
I
see it in the
can't
same headline.
understand why we just can't have a normal conversation where
No.
person A killed person B. Let's just say who that person is, no matter no matter which sort of diversity quota it's going to piss off. Like, I don't care. I just want to know actually what happened. And this idea, I think that women. I think from the study, we know that women, if they are willing to give up their lives, it's usually for their children, not for strangers.
Yeah, so I
Is
mean,
that right?
there's quite a lot of acknowledgement in sort of evolutionary sort of biology that males are just generally more likely to risk or even lose their life to save others, to save strangers. There's really interesting awards. There's an award called the Carnegie Award, where for nearly 120 years now, they've been giving out awards every single year to people around the world who have done extraordinarily brave things to save strangers. Some of them even lost their life. And 90% of winners are men. So it's like an overwhelming a majority of people that risk their life to save others are men. It's just a fact. Whether you think that's biological or socialized is a different matter, but it's just a reality right now. We never see that mentioned. And like you said, sometimes you see that the gamma bias in the same headline. You'll see like a headline, one of them, it's actually a real headline. It's something like, crazed knife man is stopped by Good Samaritan or passerby. So you'll see like knife man, and then the male hero is seen as a Good Samaritan or stranger or bystander. They're gender neutral terms, but they're knife man or gun man or henchman, con man, madman. They're all man. But then we look at the heroic side, the firefighter, police officer. They're not gendered. And why is that? Why do we? And then also like Good Samaritan, bystander, stranger, passerby. We don't say a man stopped, risked his life. A man lost his life to save this person. There's a story, very sad story, a few years ago of Sarah Everard, who was killed in London by a man, Wayne Couzens, who was just an awful person in what he did to her. Understandably, it became like global headline news, and it started a massive backlash against male violence. Male violence was in the headlines for like weeks, perhaps even months. It got out of control, to be honest. And yet within that time, the following week, there was another man in London, not even that far away from where Sarah Everard was killed, who jumped off of a bridge to save a woman who jumped off a bridge. So she jumped off, and he jumped in to the Thames after her to save her, and she survived, and he died. So there we go. We got an example of male violence, and then the following week, an example of male heroism. And only one of them made it to the news, and only one of them is gendered. So that, I feel like that's one of the causes of the problem of men losing their sense of identity, and more broadly male mental health crisis and male suicide. It's like there were so few things that are credited to men that are amazing parts of masculinity. One of them being heroism and bravery and sacrifice. and they're not gendered. Whereas the bad things of masculinity, violence and stuff like that, they are gendered. And it's like you're creating a very one-sided perspective of men that is creating a systemically negative view of masculinity that we're all suffering from, and is leading to a massive identity crisis in men, especially young men who don't really know what it is to be a man, because all the good things are being made gender neutral and all the bad things are being hyper focused in on. And that's
Yeah.
gamma bias.
Yeah, and I think there is definitely a bigger narrative that is being sort of spun and fed when it comes to men's sort of tendency for violence, and whether it's the setting of domestic abuse, which I know you've spoken to Erin Pizzi. She's done a lot of work and she's paid a high price for doing that work
Yep.
on the domestic violence front and on the violence front. And again, yes, most women are killed by men, but then also most men are killed by other men. So, and it's the actual numbers in terms of the sort of the percentage of the society that is actually affected is very, very low, even though it feels in the culture and the ether like it's everywhere. So just sort of before
Yeah.
we finish, do you just want to give us some of like the biggest, statistics and the facts when it comes to the real numbers on sort of the violence front?
Well, I mean, it's a very difficult subject to talk about because people want like simple answers, of which there aren't any. So a lot of people make the mistake of conflating all areas of violence together. So street violence, homicide, for example, is largely around gangs and is almost exclusively by men. So you're talking about like 80% or more acts of violence, and even more so for homicide, are men. And people seem to think that's the same for domestic violence, which is not true. Like violence on the street between strangers is completely different to domestic violence, completely different risk factors, different motives, different sort of demographics, and obviously difference in terms of gender disparity of perpetration. Yes, men conduct most street assaults, but that doesn't mean they're the most violent in relationships, and it's not true. In fact, women and men are more or less equally violent in relationships. Difference in terms of severity, but equally violent in terms of outcomes. And we don't talk about that. We don't want to, like I said, gamma bias. We don't talk about violence against men. In fact, in the UK, male victims of abuse are classified as victims of violence against women, which is just just one of the stupidest things I've ever heard.
Hold
And
on,
yeah, we don't.
hold on. Can you just repeat that? I can't believe that. Are you
Yeah.
tell
So if you are a
what?
man who's being a victim of violence by a woman in a relationship, you're considered a victim of violence against women. You're considered a woman, basically. So you'll read documents. The government released a document, and it's a real document. It said male victims of crimes considered violence against women. So male victims of violence against women. That's the ultimate backward somersault mental gymnastics gold medal winning Olympic bullshit. Like, that is just like we've actually now arrived at the most insane. And there was a huge backlash. And the ministers who put out that document were asked, like, don't you think calling men victims of violence against women is hugely invalidating and embarrassing for you and for them? Like, why have you done that? And the government said if we had referred to them as victims of violence against men and boys, we would have caused a lot of upset to the domestic violence industry and a lot of women's organisations. So they were saying that we're basically afraid of the domestic violence industry and a lot of women in that industry of actually acknowledging the existence of male victims of abuse. So instead of seeing men as victims of violence by women, they're somehow now victims of violence against women. They're somehow women now, and like we would never say women that are victims of male homelessness or women that are victims of male suicide. It's like it's, but yet we'll say male victims of violence against women. And yeah, that's where we are. So that's how deluded people have become, including our own government.
That's
Yeah.
insane. I'm way more upset about the fact that I can't even get the facts like right if I Google them because they are conflating
No.
the subjects that are too uncomfortable for them to talk about.
Well, they conflate the subjects and they use different ways of collecting data. So in the UK, we have the Office for National Statistics, which is basically the best source for data. It's the government data. It's using police reports mostly. And because men file reports less than women for abuse, it means they're underrepresented in that data. It means that a lot of them don't make it through to the data because they're using a lot of it police reports. So that data says 1 in 3 victims of abuse is a man in the UK, which is still a significant number, in my opinion, probably more than most people realize. 1 in 3 victims of abuse is a man. But if you go to America and you get their data is not from the ONS, their data is from the CDC, and more specifically the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey. And that's a survey, and they call people up. They call up men and women, and they extrapolate that data to the to nationwide sort of estimates. And they find that men and women are more or less victim of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, at more or less equal rates. Depending on sexual violence, more for women, physical violence, more for men, but more or less, it's sort of, it goes each way, especially physical violence. Sometimes it's more women, sometimes it's more men. And that's because we're not using police reports, so we're not subject to that same bias. And that's where it changes. Like, although it's 50-50 in terms of perpetration, it's not 50-50 in terms of support. There's only about 2 refuges in the entirety of North America for men. 2, and thousands for women. Thousands and thousands. In the UK, in England, we have about 3,600 beds for women or more, and about 50 for men. So it's about 2%, 3% maybe in terms of refuge for men versus refuge for women. And yet it's at least 30% of all victims are men. And so there's another example of a massive disparity and a massive power imbalance, basically, which you wouldn't like to hear. And it's just very unpopular. Very unpopular. And it's getting worse. Like, violence by women is actually increasing. Violence against women is decreasing. And no one talks about it. And also, like, we talk about the very narrow, memeified view of domestic violence. Like, a woman's killed every 3 days, which is true. But that's a very small percentage of all domestic violence. And that excludes the way in which women are uniquely violent towards men. So women are more often psychologically violent and abusive. And there are a lot of men who are pushed to suicide as a result of experiences of abuse. And in fact, if you include all people that take their life as a result of domestic abuse, there are actually more male deaths associated with domestic abuse than female deaths. So these are just a few ways in which some of these sound bites are very manipulative and narrow. It's not that they're not true; they are true, but they're just not the complete truth. You'll see a stat that says something like 99% of rapists are men, which is absolutely correct, but only because women can't commit rape by law. So to be a rapist, you have to have a penis. So I don't understand how a woman can be guilty of a crime that means you have to have a penis. So although it's true to say 99% of rapists are men, it's not the complete truth, because women can't even commit rape by law or academically. So it's like misleading, very misleading. It's lying, basically. It's total bogus.
I wish that we could just have the world where we've got the facts and then we can make sense of that. Because right now it kind of feels like the data is being manipulated so much that we just can't make sense of.
Well, just think about, we refer to it as violence against women. We don't say domestic violence, which is what I say, because men can be victims too. And I don't care if it's just 1% of victims are men. I would still say domestic violence, because he deserves to be spoken about. But it's 30% or more. And we still call it violence against women, not domestic. So I would say we need to talk about the issue, not the gender. And we need to talk about domestic violence and more broadly violence in general. And no one should be left behind. No one should be excluded from that conversation. And certainly not men.
Okay, that's how so given that politicians are currently unwilling, unable, not brave enough to actually touch the subject, the audience has got imperfect us talking about it. But what can, though, that imperfect audience, the unqualified people do to try and change the direction of the future travel? What are you doing in terms of your campaign, and where can people find you online?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like just by listening to this podcast all the way through, you've done more than most politicians have. So congratulations for that. Although it's a very low bar. I mean, we're at the stage of awareness raising at the minute. I think we're at a point of just having discussions and demanding change. So as long as you're part of that, listening and contributing and trying to understand men in life in good faith, that's plenty. I mean, I'm launching a campaign at the minute for a Minister for Men. That's one of the things I've been doing for years. I want to get the UK to appoint a Minister for Men to investigate and reduce a lot of the issues I talk about. In the UK, we have a Minister for Women, a Minister for Women's Health, and an Ambassador for Women's Health. Again, I support all of those positions, but none of them exist for men, despite in health, for example, men being behind in pretty much every single metric. So I think we need a Minister for Men. If you go to ministerformen.com, you'll be directed to a shop that I set up that basically sells these. These are a series of postcards that we've now released that basically make the ability to write to your MP a lot easier. So this one's about drug misuse. This one's about street violence. This one's about fathers' rights. This one is about, like I said, it is legally impossible for a woman to commit rape by UK law. And they're basically postcards. So that's just normal postcard, and on the back it's the address of Westminster and a blank space for your message. And the idea is you buy them, you write in your message to your MP, you add their name, put a stamp on it, and it can go to Westminster. And people don't realise that it's your democratic right to be able to contact your MP and to get a response from them. And yeah, I don't know anyone that's ever written to their MP. I've never written to my MP, and I'm the sort of person that would. I don't know. And so the idea of this product is to make the process of writing to your MP and demanding change a little bit easier. You could do it in 30 seconds. Like you could do it without this, of course, but it's a lot harder. But to write a message, address is already there, put the name on it, stamp in. It takes a minute or so, and that's the sort of thing that I think actually gets changed. Like physical advocacy, actually being on the desk or through the front door of MPs rather than on social media where you can be ignored. So if you want to be part of change, the very beginning of change, ministerformen.com, and you can do it now. It's of course it's for UK following, but a lot of people want to expand the concept into other countries. So yeah.
And where can people find you online to follow your work?
Online, more generally speaking, of course, you can get to all this through my Instagram page, which is TheTinMen, all one word. And through Instagram, there's LinkedIn, there's Facebook, there's a Discord, there's a Twitter account. So Instagram's the main center point, TheTinMen, and there's lots of conversations going on there that you're welcome to join in.
Lovely. Well, you've been very, very generous with your time. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you George from TheTinMen.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.